All right, guys, this is a brief walkthrough of creating a multi-link suspension. It's also similar to a double wishbone suspension for Vex Robotics. So what we have here are what we call some 1-bys. I've cut them down so you've got two basically equal length sections. What you'll need to do is start by connecting these 1-bys with standoffs here and here. You can see there. That's going to give these some structural integrity for you mounting them into the rest of the unit. So start by connecting those with some standoffs. You put screws on the outside and run them into the standoffs. You're also going to want to include bearing blocks. So you see right here, if I can get this at a halfway decent angle. Let's see here. There we go. Okay, you can see all these bearing blocks in here. So you can see I've got bearing blocks here. This one should have been, the pins have come out of that one. So you got a bearing block here, you got bearing blocks down here at the bottom, and what those are going to do is those are going to reduce the amount of wiggle in your assembly setup. You also want to put bearing blocks on the outside of the metal that you mount it to. Now I'm using C-channel, which will work just fine, although we have a shortage of that in class, so I'm encouraging students to use a different type of metal. I'm encouraging students to use this slotted frame metal for doing their supports here and here. But what you do is you take these two pieces of metal and you're going to put a standoff between them as well. You can see the importance of standoffs in creating structural integrity for these units. Then what you'll do is you'll mount those 1-bys that you've connected with standoffs and put the bearing blocks on into those two pieces you have coming down from your frame. So you see we've got bearing blocks here. You run an axle through it. That axle goes through the assembly here. Out the other side, you put a collar on both sides. I've left the collar off here for easy assembly and disassembly. But you'll need these metal collars if you want the whole thing to be nice and stable. And at that point, you'll have it nicely mounted up to the frame. You'll want to run a rubber band from your top standoff around this middle standoff and down to the bottom axle, and that'll actually give you the ability to adjust the load on your suspension, or the spring rate on your suspension, by tightening and loosening that rubber band, which is kind of cool. You'll need to use some spacers on your standoff here and here to make it slightly wider than the 1-bys that you're using for your multi-link suspension here, because otherwise they won't move freely. So I use the same size standoff that I used here, but I use a couple of spacers so that this assembly is slightly wider than this assembly. You also need to make sure that this motor can move through the assembly, so make sure that you're mounting that properly. To the end here, we're going to use a piece of C-channel. Again, you run an axle through the top. I used a rubber collar here for the sake of quick assembly and disassembly, but really you should use metal collars on both sides for the sake of structural integrity. And then what you're going to do is you're going to mount this motor, if we can come back into focus. You're going to put a bearing block on the outside of the C-channel and then run screws through the bearing block into your motor. Again, bearing blocks are these black things right here. After that, you run an axle through the entire thing into the motor. You put collars on both sides and a small spacer. You put a spacer here to keep the wheel from rubbing against your C-channel. And, of course, a collar on the outside. So that's a brief overview of how to assemble this multi-link / double A-arm suspension assembly. We use C-channel for this part, but we're going to use this slotted frame metal for these supports coming down here and here. All right, there you have it.